Tonight, we're talking to retired diplomat and former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Chaz Freeman. Ambassador Freeman served in the United States Foreign Service, the state, and the Defense Departments over the course of 30 years in a variety of positions until he was finally nominated for the chair of the National Intelligence Council. But he had to withdraw his name after being considered too controversial by both sides of the aisle for criticizing the Israel lobby. Now, Ambassador Freeman speaks several languages fluently, including Chinese and Arabic, which is how he ended up in such varied positions throughout his career. He spent many years in Asia, assigned to the State Department's China desk. He was the State Department's deputy director for Taiwan and was Nixon's principal interpreter during his 1972 visit to Beijing. He also had a big hand in the development of the Taiwan Relations Act. He was later moved to the Middle East, where he became the United States ambassador to Saudi Arabia in 1989, serving before and after Operation Desert Storm. In his 30-year diplomatic career, Ambassador Freeman received 2 Distinguished Public Service Awards, 3 Presidential Meritorious Service Awards, 2 Distinguished Honor Awards, the CIA Medallion, a Defense Meritorious Service Award, and 4 Superior Honor Awards. But nonetheless, despite all the accolades, if you don't go along with the established narratives and the military-industrial complex agenda, there's only so far up the ladder they'll allow you to go before they kick you out of the club. Now, he's written several books, including The Diplomat's Dictionary, Interesting Times, China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige, and America's Misadventures in the Middle East. I'm really excited to have this conversation with the ambassador about all the foreign policy decisions that are going on around the world and the war posturing and where we're headed with China and Ukraine and Israel. But first, get 15% off your first order of Field of Greens when you use the promo code Kim at checkout. I love this stuff. It is a fine powder made from dehydrated fruits and vegetables, whole fruits and vegetables. They carefully select the right ones to give you the most nutrients in your diet possible. It's really difficult to get all your fruits and vegetables into your diet, and Field of Greens makes it so easy to do. You just take a scoop of this powder, mix it into your ice water or your iced tea. I really prefer it with water, actually. I think it really tastes delicious. I look forward to drinking it. I really like the lemon lime. It's a great way to get your fruits and vegetables into your diet. They do have mixed berry flavor. They have energy version. They also have other products on their website. So I'm also a big fan of their lean product, which is some pills that you take, and it helps curb your appetite, really helps boost your your metabolism. So there's other products on their site. Just browse around, pick out what you want, and get 15% off your order when you use that promo code Kim at checkout. Again, fieldofgreens.com. All right. Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
So I want to start off with a little bit of background. I want to go back in time before we get into the current situation, the foreign policy for the United States. I want to get into some of your background so that the audience can understand who you are. First, I want to talk about why you withdrew your name from being chair of the National Intelligence Council. Why were you being attacked by, it looks like, both Republicans and Democrats?
Well, I had been critical of Israeli policies in the West Bank, and generally, I thought they would end badly for Israel. And I was basically mugged by the Israel lobby. And it became apparent very soon. I had been recruited for 2 reasons. One, to try to restore credibility to the intelligence product, which had been gravely damaged by the farcical intelligence run-up to the invasion of Iraq, as well as other issues. And second, to do some management reforms inside the National Intelligence Council. It became apparent I couldn't do either if I was under constant attack and so I wasn't anything I wanted to do anyway, so I withdrew.
Want to talk about this Israel lobby. What is it? It still seems to be incredibly powerful in our foreign politics. I mean, we just saw this week the president of Israel show up to D.C., spoke to Biden, met with in a joint session of Congress. Everybody stood up and cheered. There were some that boycotted because of the treatment of the Palestinians in the West Bank. But, we also see RFK Jr., who's out there running for president, and he continues to be smeared or slandered as an anti-Semite. And then when that happens, he often comes back and, is ultra pro-Israel. I mean, just doing almost overcorrecting, or, maybe it's a genuine feeling, but it almost feels like an overcorrection to be like, no, I'm a friend of Israel, big friend of Israel. Why? And it just makes me wonder, why is there such a hold on the United States? Like, what is that power that Israel has over us, to where essentially when the president spoke in the joint session of Congress, he almost made it sound like we're one nation, the United States and Israel, that we are intertwined, one and the same, and we will always be friends. What is it with that?
Well, it's essentially the power of campaign donations, and sometimes some pretty dirty politics. If you're critical of Israel, you can expect your opponent to get money from the Israel lobby. And if you look at the figures, American Jews and other supporters of Israel, and there are quite a few who are Christian fundamentalist, Christian Zionists, give disproportionately to politics. They're very good citizens, but they have a cause, and no politician can ignore this without suffering the consequences. So it's really very unusual that 9 people, in this case, Bernie Sanders and the several of the women,
the squad,
squad, actually boycotted this. And they did that because the entire world outside the United States sees Israel as a grotesque human rights violator and an aggressor in its region. And yet the United States protects it in the Security Council with vetoes. And we actually pay for many of the horrible things that it does to the Palestinians. American subsidies to Israel now, I think, not accounting for inflation, amount to $140 billion or so. It's by far the biggest recipient of U.S. aid, even though it's wealthier than some states in the United States. So this is all the power of a lobby that is very committed to supporting Israel. That's understandable. They are matched, I think, only by the National Rifle Association in terms of their ability to intimidate congressmen and women. And so you get the result you do. You get not just the invitation to Herzog, the symbolic president of Israel, but Biden now inviting Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is terribly controversial in Israel and frankly despised internationally. But he's invited him to the White House. Why? Because we're about to have a presidential campaign, and this is good for campaign contributions and support. So nobody wants to be against Israel. And if you're critical of Israel, as I was, you can expect to suffer for the rest of your life from ankle biters who are after you and never let go.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that we have such an incredibly powerful lobby that, that it comes down to political donations. I mean, you'd think that the bureaucrats who are in, the careerists, you would think would hopefully do a job not based on politics, not based on who's doing campaign donations. Why is it that the bureaucrats seem to be beholden, or is there like a different forces at play with the careerists, where they feel like, okay, we have to go along or else? I mean, what is it that's causing them to also seemingly do the dirty work of Israel in the Middle East?
Policy officials who deal with Israel are almost without exception committed to Zionism, often Jewish, but whether they are or are not, committed to the Zionist cause. So if you're a career person, the worst thing you can do would be to be branded a, quote, Arabist, unquote, somebody who understands the Arabs. Because of that, by definition, politically in the United States, if you understand the Arabs, you must be anti-Israel. I would say one other thing here, and that is that Israel has a formidable information warfare machine called Hasbara, explanation in Hebrew, and they have succeeded in confusing two issues. One is the issue of Israel, a foreign country, and its policies in its region and toward the captive Arab populations it controls and disenfranchises and bombs and kills. And the other is anti-Semitism, meaning hatred of Jews. The two are very different. I consider myself actually very pro-Jewish, and I think most Americans are. I don't think anti-Semitism is such as much of a problem in the United States these days. It was. But certainly there are more and more people, particularly in the Democratic Party, who are very critical of the state of Israel and its policies and see it as something of an albatross around the neck of the United States internationally, because we've made Israel's enemies our own. And Israel has an almost infinite supply of enemies given its behavior. We are the enablers, just as you enable an alcoholic by giving the alcoholic money to buy whiskey or wine or whatever. We give Israel the money it needs to keep going. And we do it through government subventions, and we do it through tax breaks that are unique to Israel. Most of the time, you can't take a tax deduction for giving to a foreign charity, but you can in the case of Israel. So Israel has all sorts of privileges in our society, which are the product of the power of the Zionist lobby, as I mentioned.
Yeah, it's it was interesting this week watching the president say, basically we're one, that we're and for Congress to pass a statement basically saying that we're always going to be a supporter of Israel. I find that particularly interesting because when you study the history of Israel, I mean, this is a very new country. They popped up only 75 years ago, really. It's really impressive when you think about how a country could just start 75 years ago and be as powerful and wealthy as it is. That takes a certain type of dedication. It takes a certain type of mentality. I've been there, I've traveled around the West Bank, dined with Palestinians, met with Palestinians, watched how they had to cross through. I crossed through the checkpoints with them and dealt with all of that with them. And when you're there, it's astonishing. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing that this is happening to them. We don't hear anything really about it here in the United States. But it's also a level of ruthlessness. When I was over there, I thought, wow, this is a country that in 75 years has been able to grow to be as powerful as it is. You don't do that without being ruthless. I mean, you've got to be committed to your cause, and you've got to get really extremist mentalities in order to accomplish something that impressive. It's very, very impressive. But that being said, I don't think they're really an ally to the United States. I think they want the United States to be an ally to them. But I think ultimately, in order to be that successful, you have to be very selfish. And I think that they would, on a dime, turn on the United States and realign themselves with a new ally who they feel like is going to be protecting their interests. I think they're selfish. So they're just about themselves or about their own survival, and they'll do anything to survive. And that includes cutting the United States off if that's what it requires, and pivoting towards new allies if that requires, if that's going to be China and Saudi Arabia, for example. So I find it really interesting that we do this kind of pledge of allegiance to Israel when I don't believe they're actually. I think they've pledged allegiance to themselves, rightfully so. I think every nation should do that for themselves. But now I think we're witnessing a pivot with Israel, a slight pivot. They play footsie, like with Russia, for example. They don't want to take the hard line against Russia the way the United States wants them to, because they're friends with Russia. Russia helps them out at times. They've got a big population of Israelis who immigrate in from Russia. So it's not really in their best interest to make Russia into an enemy. And we're noticing that they seem to be also pivoting towards some of these nations like Saudi Arabia that they never really did before. China, when I was there, I saw a massive number of Chinese Zionists that were there, Christian Chinese Zionists, who were there supporting the Zionist cause. And there is a big difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. But there were a lot of Chinese, I mean, way more Chinese than I saw Americans. So I could see Israel very easily pivoting towards China's our new best friend because they're giving us gobs of money and they're supporting us. What do you think is going to happen with that? I mean, do you see what I'm saying about it? Like, I do think that they're going to pivot. I think we're watching this pivot happen and they're making new friends. I mean, what's your assessment with what's going on in that part of the world?
Well, I think that Israel, like other countries, perhaps more so than most, is indeed ruthless in pursuit of its own interests. And it feels no loyalty to any other country.
Right.
Israel has a dilemma, and it's not an unusual one in the region. There's not a single country in that region, although we call various countries allies, that has any commitment to the United States at all. All of them are looking to the United States for protection and pursuing their own interests. And that's true of Israel. But Israel has an issue because there isn't any other great power beyond the United States that's willing to subsidize it, protect it in the UN, endorse its policies toward the Palestinians, overlook its human rights violations. They might try to play footsie with China. And indeed, Mr. Netanyahu has arranged to go to Beijing on some sort of trip to try to work out a bigger relationship with China, despite American opposition to that. But the Chinese are not going to play too much ball. They have no desire to assume this burden that we carry. Israel's relationship with Russia, as you indicated, is quite close. Like India, like China, they refused to take sides in the Ukraine war against Russia. That reflects in part the fact that about 20% of Israelis are Russian speakers, and a good deal of the Russian oligarchy is Jewish and has sought refuge from Mr. Putin in Israel. So this is a very complicated country. Out for itself, that's understandable, but it is ruthless, you said. Sometimes it's more than ruthless, it's quite vicious toward its critics, as I suspect you may have already experienced.
Yeah, I think anybody who's critical of Zionism and the idea of a Jewish nation, I think many of us criticize the idea simply because there are other people who are there who are not Jewish, and then they're being shoved around and mistreated. And it is an astonishing human rights abuse to witness. I wish everybody in this country could take a trip over there to witness that side of it, because it's akin to something we've read in history books with how Native Americans were treated when colonizers showed up on the shore of America. It very much feels the same way. It feels like they are that the end goal is to essentially put Palestinians in their own little reservations, and that Israel ultimately controls the entire region. But then it's like, well, the Palestinians can have this little zone where they live, and then they have to cross through Israel in order to get to another zone, another reservation filled with more native Palestinian people. That's what it really appears to me. But what is happening, do you think, with Saudi Arabia? So you were the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. We're seeing now Saudi Arabia, they're making some really interesting moves. They're talking about really diversifying the sales of oil and allowing other currencies rather than the U.S. dollar to be the exclusive currency. Would be the collapse of the petrodollar. They're not happy with the United States. They're not happy with the rhetoric. You've got, Trump made it a point to go over to Saudi Arabia to embrace the Saudis. Biden and Democrats, on the other hand, keep Saudis at an arm's length. They accuse Saudi Arabia of a bunch of human rights abuses. Probably most countries in the region commit human rights abuses, but by our standards. What do you think the future is for Saudi Arabia and the United States? This relationship.
Well, Saudi Arabia back in 1945 hitched its wagon to the United States, and it had a very successful ride. huge number of Saudis are educated here in the United States. I think there are more U.S. PhDs in the Saudi cabinet than there are in the entire U.S. Congress. And the country became very Americanized in a way. It wasn't immediately obvious because austere religious practices concealed it. But Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, who's now the de facto ruler in the kingdom, has greatly liberalized the controls on social practices and basically driven the more reactionary clergy away. So Saudi Arabia is going through a huge social revolution, but it has also declared its independence from the United States. Why did it do that? Because it was shocked by the American inability to distinguish between the Saudi royal family and Saudi Arabia as a country, and some Saudis who committed the atrocities of 9/11. It felt betrayed by the United States. It had looked to the United States for protection, but then it saw Hosni Mubarak in Egypt overthrown, and that was almost gleefully accepted by the United States rather than opposed. And Iran has done some military operations intercepting oil tankers and other activities in the Strait of Hormuz that are very threatening to the Saudis, and the United States basically has done nothing. So the Saudis have decided we are not reliable, and they have tried to diversify their international relations. They have the same problem the Israelis do, however. There's nobody who can really take our place. There's no country that has the military power projection capability that we do to come to their aid when they need it. Having said that, their economic relationship with China in particularly is burgeoning. They have almost incorporated Russia into OPEC, the oil cartel. They have very good relations with Moscow and with Beijing. And they are very much on an independent course. I don't see them coming back to the American fold. I think they are now a middle-ranking power. Biden and company declared they would make Saudi Arabia a pariah and isolate it, but the opposite has happened. It's now courted by everybody for its money and its international influence, given the fact that it's got two of the holy cities of Islam, the third being Jerusalem, under its control.
Yeah. You almost make the case, I know you're not intending to do this, but you almost make the case for the number one export of the United States seems to be defense. That's the thing we seem to offer. And with what you're saying is that with Israel, if they can't get it from someone else, then they almost need to remain allied with the United States in order to secure their defense. The same thing for Saudi Arabia. They would need to remain allied with the United States in order to secure their defense. I wish that defense was not our number one export. It just seems to be the thing that we've got, that everybody wants us to be protected by the United States. And so we've got all these bases everywhere, and we just keep to go to end. We continue to posture and remain in endless war. But what other alternatives do we have? I mean, if that is the only thing keeping these countries aligned with us, because it also serves the United States' interests, obviously. It's not just about these other countries. It's about our own interests. With Israel, I guess, in order to have a foothold in the Middle East, in order to have almost like a base, it's like a de facto military that operates on our behalf, that does things that we're not even able to do under our Constitution, they're able to pull off. So is it in our best interest to remain allied with Israel and continue this, we'll defend you? Same thing with Saudi Arabia. Is it in our best interest? I mean, look, if the petrodollar collapses, that is going to be devastating for people here at home. The dollar losing value is bad news for all of us. It's not. I don't like that we're tied to the Saudis in this way. I don't like that it's tied to oil in this way. But there's a reality there that I also don't like being poor and having to stand in bread lines. I think a lot of Americans would revolt against that. So, what is our alternative with our foreign policy in the Middle East?
Well, you're absolutely right. What we basically offer is protection. These are protected states, protected by the United States. In return for that, in the past, they followed our guidance. They no longer do. Israel pays no attention to very much of anything we say. And the Saudis have now joined Israel in the same disdain for American guidance. But I would say we have a broader problem. We have undertaken foreign policy which is no longer based on persuading people that it's in their interest to do things that we want them to do, but we coerce them. Sanctions. We have sanctions on almost everybody, and except Israel. And we are putting our own status as the global financial hegemon in jeopardy by making it more and more difficult to transact business in dollars. Just the other day, Iraqi banks 14 of them were put under sanctions by us, which means that they are going to deal with other countries, not in dollars, but in something else. And this on the verge of the eve of the BRICS gathering in South Africa, which is talking about alternatives to the dollar. This strikes me as shooting ourselves in the foot. Like you, I'd like to see us return to a relationship with the world which is not based on our being mercenaries, our being soldiers for hire, in effect, and basing our relationships on arms sales. I used to think that we had a great deal more to offer in this country than that, and I think we probably still do. But this is pretty entrenched now. You look at what happens in budget debates in the Congress, and again, money counts, and defense contractors have a lot of money, thanks to you and me and other taxpayers. And we have politics which the world sees as notoriously venal. Anyone elected to public office in the United States immediately has to have his or her hand out in order to get reelected. And people buy and sell votes pretty openly. So if you go up against the 5 major defense contracting companies, you're going to pay. You're going to pay in the same way that you do with the Israel lobby. I think the basic problem is the venality of our politics, in other words. The problem starts at home, and it has to be fixed at home. It's not going to get fixed in the Middle East. It's not going to get fixed by doing proxy wars in Ukraine or or going to war with China. God help us.
What do you think the United States foreign policy should pivot to? I mean, we still have a lot of other areas of the world I want to cover. But while we're on this, I mean, we are with Saudi Arabia protecting the dollar as the world currency. If we stop doing that, because a lot of me says, well, why don't we just become more isolationist, just go back home, don't worry about what's going on in Israel or the Middle East, don't worry about what's going on in Ukraine, don't worry about what's going on in Taiwan, just go home and focus on ourselves and our homeless problems and all the other issues that we have here in the United States. But the only thing that makes me say, well, but there would be one problem, and that is the world currency, the dollar being the world currency. And so if we became, if we just kind of abandoned the current foreign policy of being the largest exporter of defense, and we just pivoted to home, what would happen? What would ultimately happen? I mean, we could see mass inflation if all the dollars started just onshoring because people are just dumping them. So what do you think? What should we do, and how could we make that pivot with the least amount of pain?
Well, our global primacy rests on the fact that the dollar is the universal mechanism for settling trade transactions. And therefore, it is a major factor in every country's foreign exchange reserves. If something happens, like other currencies rise to reduce the role of the dollar or replace it, our foreign presence, the 800 bases you referred to, will be over because we won't be able to pay for them. In fact,
Right.
We can't pay for our government now. We borrow 1.3 billion or so, trillion or so every year in order just to keep the government in business before we take any initiatives at all. And we're able to do this because of the dollar. We don't have to produce things. We can just print money, and little green paper portraits of dead presidents are accepted as legal tender pretty much everywhere, until we began to sanction everybody and get in the way of that, which is pretty stupid. Anyway, that's one thing. If we lose the global financial hegemony, our primacy in other spheres will go away too. It won't be just that we will have inflation and suffer at home. We will. But I don't see this really as an either or situation. I think what we've done in the wake of the end of the Cold War, where the Soviet Union basically gave up, they defaulted and they dropped out of the contest for a global primacy, is accept global primacy. We have the equivalent of a global sphere of influence that extends to the borders of Russia and China and North Korea and Iran, and is present everywhere else. And this is very, very expensive in blood, in treasure, in every way. And it is a distraction from all of the problems we've accumulated at home, whether they're collapsing infrastructure, declining educational standards, industry that is increasingly uncompetitive and requires tariff protection to function, and of course, gridlock in government, indecision, all those good things. I would say that we do need to pivot back home, but we don't need to give up our international role entirely. We need to pick and choose. Where are the priorities that we set? It seems that absolutely every spot on Earth, including most recently the Solomon Islands, which I bet most people couldn't find on a map, are of vital interest to the United States. We have to have a military base there, or at least military access. Why is that? Other countries seem to be able to decide what's important and what isn't. But we don't seem to be able to do that anymore. And maybe that has to do, again, with venality in domestic politics, which means that everyone with money gets to set the priorities they choose, whether they make sense in the broader context or not.
Yeah, it seems like we're not going to be making wise preemptive decisions to pivot, seeing what's obviously coming. I mean, obviously other nations are rising. Obviously there's going to come a time when the dollar is not the only global currency. It might be, I think it'll still remain one of the main ones, but I don't think it'll be the only one like it's been for so long. So, but our politicians are not having these conversations. They're not pivoting. They're just doubling down. I mean, they're just like, let's go to more war. Let's do more of the same, hoping that this is going to keep us on top and keep us in control. But it seems like from what you're saying, ultimately we're going to be forced to change. Ultimately, when the inevitable happens and these countries rise up and these currencies rise up, we won't be able to afford it, and we'll have inflation at home. We'll have domestic crises. And that is when the politicians will have no choice but to pivot towards home and domestic policy. But it's never a good idea to wait for the natural disaster before you finally hurricane-proof your house. Ideally, you should do that before it hits, not after it hits. But unfortunately, it looks like we're just going to be pummeled, and then these guys will finally wake up because they're not preempting this right now. I want to pivot. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, complacency is really not a strategy. Complacency, doing more of the same, which is the Washington playbook. If at first you don't succeed, throw more money at it. In other contexts, doing more of the same and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. Think about it.
Yeah. Well, we are insane. There's no doubt about that. And one of the ways that we're really insane, and I want to pivot to China, is by aggressively going after China. Taiwan, what should the U.S. policy be in regards to Taiwan? Because right now what we're doing is we're doubling down on this war in Ukraine, which is not a winning. It's not a winning prospect over there. The counteroffensive is not going well. We're just throwing a lot of weapons, and Ukrainians are throwing bodies at this and it's not really working. Russia's ultimately going to end up with a big chunk of land over there, and it is going to be what it is. But one of the reasoning for why they're continuing to double down on this is because they're like, well, we can't lose. We can't let Ukraine lose, because then China, if we let Russia win, then China's going to see this and they're going to have they're going to gain power in regards to Taiwan. The idea is that we would protect Taiwan militarily. What should be the foreign policy in regards to Taiwan?
Well, 50 years ago, Nixon, Kissinger, and later Jimmy Carter worked out a modus vivendi on Taiwan, which persuaded the Chinese that it wasn't an urgent issue. It could be deferred indefinitely, and it could be solved peacefully through negotiations. We've thrown that framework out, and now it's all about military stuff, and we're going to deter China and fight for Taiwan and so forth. You fight for Taiwan, first of all, it's very different, the situation from Ukraine. By the way, I think we're about to see a Russian offensive in Ukraine. I think they're preparing it, and I think from the beginning it's been absurd to imagine that Ukrainians, who are enormously brave and who have become very capable militarily, could prevail against their larger neighbor. Taiwan is not the neighbor of China, it's part of China. It's separated from China only because the United States intervened in the Chinese Civil War in 1950 in order to prevent it from reigniting when we were fighting in Korea. We did that, by the way, before the Chinese intervened in Korea, when we were just fighting North Koreans. And we've stayed there for, 73 years now. We have protected Taiwan militarily. But the Chinese Civil War hasn't ended. The Chinese feel passionately about it, and they intend to end it. And if they can't end it by peaceful negotiations, which we do everything in our power to preclude, they will end it with the use of force. And this isn't a joke. This isn't another country. We had a war we fought proxy war with China and in Korea. We didn't win. We fought a proxy war with China in Vietnam. We didn't win. This won't be a proxy war. This is Chinese territory. And the only way you can defend Taiwan is by attacking across the strait at bases on the Chinese mainland. The minute we do that, you run the risk of a nuclear exchange, because the Chinese are not going to sit there and allow us to bomb their cities without bombing back. And so when we look at this, we should look at it seriously, realistically. Every war game that is done that is worthy of the name, including those done on a classified basis within the Defense Department, shows that we lose in such a fight, even if it doesn't go nuclear. If it goes nuclear, you and I probably won't be here. So I think the stakes are too high. And the answer is to restore a modus vivendi through diplomacy with China. But we are not engaging in diplomacy with China. We go to China and we lecture and we tell them what our view is, and we don't listen to theirs, and we don't address the concerns they have. That is the recipe for war. That is exactly what happened to kick off the Ukraine war. The Russians demanded negotiations on security in Europe. We told them we weren't going to talk to them. They said, okay, we're going to do something military, and they did. Now, whether that was smart on their part is a different question. I think it wasn't very smart. But there's no doubt that we're replaying this scenario with the Chinese. It's not a good thing.
Do you think that our leaders are crazy enough to really, truly go to war with China in their part of the world? I mean, we would be in their, right there. It's not like, and that's the problem with, at least, yeah, it just, that makes absolutely zero sense to go pick a fight with another country on their turf. They've got the home team advantage, the home court advantage. It's not good. Are we really that crazy?
Well, we have a president who on 4 occasions, notwithstanding the fact that he does not have the constitutional authority to take us into war, that is a prerogative of Congress, has pledged to do exactly that. So I would say there are a couple of things that we need to remember. First, we're in China's face. We're running 3 or 4 aggressive patrols of the Chinese coast every day, naval, and aerial. They are not doing a thing on our coast yet. Believe me, they're going to arrive on our coast for reciprocity reasons, and we're not going to like it when they're off San Diego or Puget Sound or Norfolk, Virginia. We're going to freak out. They've freaked out because of what we're doing. It's very provocative. The second point, you're absolutely correct. If you have a war over Taiwan, Taiwan is 100 miles from the bases on the Chinese mainland and 6,000 miles from bases in the United States. It's not clear at this point at all whether Japan, which would be key to any defense of Taiwan, would in fact join us. Japan has to live with China. It's not that far away. And Japan has quite a history in China. For 14 years from 1931 to 1945, it rampaged through China and by some accounts killed as many as 35 million Chinese. There's nobody in North or Central China who doesn't have somebody they lost in that Japanese invasion and occupation. So the Japanese are appropriately cautious in their relationship with China, which is more powerful now economically and militarily than they are. Would they join us? No, it's not clear. South Korea will sit things out because South Korea has been invaded, or Korea, I should say, the Korean Peninsula, has been invaded 72 times in its history, mostly from the north, sometimes from Japan. It's not going to take a chance. The last thing on earth that the Koreans want to do is get into a fight with China. So they'll sit it out, which leaves us with the Australians, who are 3,000 miles away from China, and who are quite divided on the subject. So, I think you look at the countries in the region and you see that they're all hedging.
Well, we still have the Philippines over there as well. So the Philippines may, we have bases there.
The Philippines has not made no commitment to allow us to use those bases against China. We have implied that that's the case, but it's not. I think if you look at the countries in the region, the most adroit is Vietnam, which Vietnam has had 2,000 years of experience with dealing with the Chinese. It knows exactly how far it can go before it riles them up and pays a price. And the last thing on earth it's going to do, even if it gets closer to the United States, as I hope it will, the last thing on earth it's going to do is hitch its wagon to the United States if we're going to go to war with China. If we're not going to go to war with China, then we become a great deal more acceptable to everybody in the region because we don't pose a risk to them. And people are out there are calculating this. They are apprehensive about Chinese power. They're a little afraid. They want protection, but they don't want protection from a country that is going to go to war with China. They're happy to have Taiwan remain separate from the rest of China, but they don't want a war over that. They'd all suffer. So I think we need to be a bit more sophisticated, and we should find a way to return to some understanding with China about how to kick this Taiwan can down the road rather than make it an urgent matter.
It is definitely a delicate situation over there because China is not liked. It's not a country that's liked in the region by all the other countries around it, but it is also a country that they don't want to be going to war over unless they're being invaded. I mean, that's sort of the mentality of like the Vietnamese. It's, well, if of course, if China invades Vietnam and threatens Vietnam, then Vietnam would fight for Vietnam. But Vietnam doesn't want to go fighting for Taiwan. Or just picking a fight with China just to keep China from growing in power. It's, definitely Asian countries don't necessarily, there's a lot of pride in their own people. A lot of, they don't like each other. They certainly don't like China. I mean, I know that I'm Vietnamese. My family, the culture just does not like China or Chinese because of that long history.
and
Yeah,
yet
it's
the culture is heavily Chinese. And
heavily
if you go
Chinese. Yes. Yeah.
you go around Hanoi, and you see things that were destroyed in China in the Cultural Revolution that are still there. But Vietnam is, as I said, Vietnam's had a lot of experience. It's not stupid at all about it. Every Vietnamese leader has to be both on cordial terms with the leader of China and very wary of China generally.
Yeah.
And that's the model. And I think that's probably the model for most countries in the future. They will want to be close to China. They want to trade with China. They want to leverage Chinese wealth to their own benefit, as Vietnam is doing. A lot of Chinese industry is relocating to Vietnam for lower wages and to avoid American tariffs and quotas and things.
Yeah.
I think this is probably the pattern of the future. If we imagine that we can somehow exclude China from its own region, we're just delusional. That's not going to happen.
Yeah. And not to mention, but China has played a very strategic game around the world. As we've been exporting defense, they've been literally exporting goods. And now they're the largest trading partner for most of those Asian countries. So why would Japan pick a fight with China when Japan receives 14% of its imports from China, the same percentage that it receives from the United States? So and the other countries, China now exceeds the U.S. imports. China is the #1 importer of goods into those countries. And so, we saw what happened during the pandemic when we couldn't get goods and services. It's all China has to do is cut off trade and countries suffer. That's like they can weaponize, as we weaponize the dollar and put sanctions on countries, China could do a similar thing when it comes to trade and basically collapse nations. And they showed us during the pandemic that they can survive it. We can't as well. Their GDP grew. They were just fine during the pandemic. The rest of us suffered quite greatly, not being able to get toilet paper or whatever it was that we were trying to get from China. So it's interesting that the game that they're playing and the strategy, they don't, in my opinion, curious what you think of this, but they wouldn't even need to go to military war over Taiwan. They would just need to cut off trade and say, we're just going to isolate you. And good luck.
There's a famous game called Weiqi in Chinese, or Go in Japanese, which is a strategic game of about 360 moves. A master of the game knows after 90 to 120 moves whether he or she has lost or won. And I think what the Chinese want with Taiwan is for Taiwan to realize that it is going to have to compromise, come to the negotiating table, and work out a deal. And that's a hard thing for people in Taiwan to do because they've become very attached to their democracy. They have a very high standard of civil liberties. They have the rule of law. In many respects, they are, in my view, the best society that's ever existed on Chinese soil. And they fear that they would have to give up any of those things. If the Chinese can reassure them that's not the case, which I don't think they can do under Xi Jinping, but maybe a future leader, then I think you might see a peaceful resolution of this. I want to make one point about economics. We talk about GDP as though it's something concrete. It isn't. What counts in a contest with China is that China has a manufacturing sector that is twice the size of the United States. China produces 1/3 of the world's goods. We produce 1/6. Now, we have a lot more lawyers and tax accountants and insurance brokers and bureaucrats in corporate entities than the Chinese do. But if you're going to war, that's not terribly relevant. What counts is production capacity. And the Chinese produce 200 times more shipping every year than we do. If we get into a naval battle, it would be a naval battle in large measure. We don't have the capacity to repair or replace the ships we lose. They do. Same thing with Air Force. So this is not a fight we should pick. China has used its economic muscle, most notably against South Korea. South Korea agreed to the installation of a missile defense system, short range, that, however, had a radar that reached into China and could detect launches in China that the Chinese saw as threatening to their own deterrent. And so they basically put an informal embargo on South Korea and made life very difficult for Korean companies in China. And after a while, the Koreans decided that they wouldn't expand this system. But this cost the Chinese a great deal. They are now very, very much disliked in South Korea. And interestingly, there's a new poll out that shows that Chinese Americans don't like China, which is quite unusual, since I think Taiwanese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Filipino Americans, Japanese Americans Korean Americans are all pretty much detached to their homeland, but evidently Chinese Americans are not. They want to be American, not Chinese. More power to them.
What do you think of the posturing domestically against China? We're seeing a lot of this. Like we've got in Florida, Ron DeSantis wants to put a ban on Chinese citizens buying real estate in Florida. We see a lot of, there's a lot of talk about stopping China from buying businesses, stopping Chinese people, there's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of posturing against China. What do you think of all of that? Is that a good strategy, or is that doom?
I think it's essentially psychotic, to tell you the truth. I mean, it's cutting off our nose to bite our face. A very good example is renewable energy. The Chinese are by far the global leaders in solar, wind power, and now nuclear power. And we want to reduce fossil fuel consumption and produce power without contributing to global warming, we say. The only way we can do that is with the help of the Chinese. But we've actually put quota, we've banned silicon imports from Xinjiang for human rights reasons, which means we can't import solar panels from China, which is the main source for the world. And we don't import wind power either for the same reason. So if you ask about investment, would it make sense for the Chinese to buy American farms or farmland? Absolutely. Because the United States, North America, has about a fourth of the world's water, and it has 3 times as much arable land as China does, and it has only 1/4 the population. So it's much better for China to produce food in the United States and ship it as a U.S. export to China than it is for China to try to do that at home. That would be good for everybody. It would pump a lot of money into our farms and boost our exports and feed China. And what are the Chinese going to do? They buy a farm, they're going to roll up the land and take it home? I don't think so. So there's a lesson from our history. Back in the 19th century, a lot of railway bonds were issued by states in the London market and European markets. The Europeans bought these bonds, and those financed railroads in places like Kansas and Missouri and so on. And then these states went bankrupt, and they defaulted on the bonds. Well, the Europeans got left with worthless paper, and the Americans got left with railways that the Europeans had paid for. Farmland isn't transportable, and farm workers need jobs, and China is pretty good at agriculture. We could learn a bit. Off the coast of Shandong, they are farming 200 kinds of seafood, 200 kinds of seafood with mariculture. We could do the same. There's a great deal of for each country to learn from the other, and why would we forego foreign investment? We don't want other people's money. I'm in business. I'm happy to take other people's money and do things with it. As a country, I think we would be wise to do that.
I think, I hear what you're saying. I guess I'm a little reluctant about it because I think that we'd want to preserve as much as we can for American citizens, because we've got, like, for example, housing. When we've got foreign nationals coming and buying homes and renting them out, then middle-class Americans can't afford to own homes. They end up having to rent homes. And I guess there's that worry as well with when it comes to farmland, is that, I would love to see American farmers, and whether that be Chinese people who want to be American and they don't like China and they want to farm the land, then great. I would like it. I would like all of that, the resources of our country, to remain in the hands of our citizens rather than to foreign nationals. But I understand your point of, well, this creates jobs. We could certainly learn a lot from them. My grandparents were farmers, and they partnered with Japanese farmers. There was that knew a lot. They were very, very good farmers. So there's a lot to learn. That was in Weiser, Idaho. Weiser, Idaho.
Okay,
my family.
I was guessing Idaho. Yeah, that's that makes a lot of sense. Well, anyway, 0.9%, 0.9% of U.S. farmland is owned by foreigners. I mean, this is a ridiculous thing to go hysterical over. And the idea that you should discriminate against a particular nationality is pretty bad, in my view. We have a long history in this country of anti-Oriental exclusion laws. And you mentioned Japanese farmers. They didn't fare too well in World War II. And,
right.
Why do we want to repeat this kind of injustice?
But does China... Well, because I don't think we're able to go to China and buy up property. I think they have laws against that you'd have to partner with a Chinese company, or there's a lot of countries that don't let you just go in and buy their land.
You can buy property in China, but land in China is all owned by the state and basically leased on a 99-year basis to whoever occupies it. That's their system. It's not discriminatory, but no, I take your point. Maybe we should be negotiating with the Chinese if there are people who want to buy farmland in China. I don't know why they'd want to, but if they want to, maybe the Chinese should let them do it. I'd be all in favor of working out some mutually advantageous deal, rather than just, as I said, cutting off our nose to spite our face.
Yeah.
We are a capital importing country at this point. We're a debtor. China is a capital exporting country. You referred to the Belt and Road Initiative, and China is exporting not just goods but services. It's building roads and railroads and fiber optic circuits and airports and ports, and it's opening up the world, not just to itself, because if you build a port, anybody can use it. You build a road, anybody can drive down it. Build a railroad, anybody can ship goods on it. So I don't see this particularly as a menace. I would sure like to see some. I don't know if you've ever ridden Amtrak from Washington, D.C. to New York, but it's the next best thing to getting a massage. You're shaken to bits. I wouldn't mind seeing a high-speed style Chinese train there.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we've gone a little bit crazy. I hope we come back to earth at some point.
Well, I think the reason why we've gone a bit crazy, and this is kind of the last thing that I want to talk about with you, is it's fear. It's fear-based, right? We're afraid of losing our position in the world as the dominant country with the dominant culture that's exporting everything. Everybody in the world for so long wanted to be like America, and they'd watch our movies and listen to our music, and they wanted to be just like us. And we have the dollars, and people wanted to immigrate here. And there's this romanticism about America that used to be. It's really not happening as much anymore. But I think there's a fear that we are going to lose our dominant place in the world. And instead, we see a rising China. I know for many years it was the fear that it would be a rising Russia, that Russia would be the dominant country in the world. Now it's more obvious that it's going to be China. Should we be afraid of that? I mean, is there something to fear if China is the dominant nation, the dominant culture, they replace us in that way? How does that harm us?
It wasn't so long ago that Japan was going to overtake us and invade us and so forth and so on. If you remember the 1980s, Japan is number one and all that. We seem to have a phobia about losing our position, as you as you state. We became the world's largest economy sometime in the 1870s. Well, we're no longer the world's largest economy by many measures. I mentioned manufacturing earlier, but in terms of purchasing power, the Chinese economy is about 1/3 larger than ours already, and getting larger, growing faster. So this is disturbing. If you've been number one for a long time, you take that for granted. You feel threatened when somebody's bigger, stronger, maybe more capable than you. So that's entirely natural. I note, however, that other countries in the past have dealt with this. That's the way Britain felt about us in the 19th century. And somehow they got over it. I think we need to get over this. We need to recognize that the reason we're not as admired as we once were is we're not as admirable as we once were. Our domestic problems, whether they're gun violence or racism or inequality or homelessness or plutocracy, any unequal income distribution and injustice to minorities, apart from racism, these are all visible to the world. The answer, if we want to be number one again in terms of the most admired country, is to get our act together, set a good example, and do that at home, not to go out and try to convince foreigners with bayonets or M2s that they should like us. Generally speaking, if you want to establish a relationship, courting people is better than raping them in terms of establishing a durable and fair, mutually agreeable basis for getting along. So I think I come back to the fact that we need to get our domestic act together, and it's a great tragedy that we're not having the debate about that domestically that we should be. As we were discussing earlier, there's a great deal of complacency. There's a lot of hubris. USA, 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 we're number one. Well, some respects we are, many respects we aren't. We're number one in maternal deaths in the developed world. We're number one in homelessness. We have the largest percentage of our population incarcerated in the developed world. We have a very high homicide rate. We have all sorts of issues, which are, put us not in the top rank where we ought to be. Because we were in the top rank, we have potential to be there again. God was very kind to this country, gave us an incredible wealth of landscapes and agricultural potential, an amazingly diverse population, 2 oceans on either side to protect us from other countries, and no challengers in our hemisphere. Otto von Bismarck once said of the United States that God had been very kind to us. Germany, of course, has all kinds of nasty people on its borders. The French, the British, the Italians, the Poles. These are not nice people. And if you're German, but he said, well, the Americans to their north, they have the meek, polite Canadians. And to the south, they have the happy-go-lucky Mexicans whom they've taught not to be uppity. And to the east and west, their neighbors are fish. Now, that is a pretty admirable situation to be in. And we really ought to take advantage of it instead of running around the world trying to tell other people how to manage their affairs. We should be trying to manage our affairs while protecting ourselves appropriately in terms of relationships with others that are mainly cooperative, not antagonistic. Why do we go around making enemies? Why do we push China and Russia together? That is pretty crazy. So I think we need to have a bit of a domestic discussion about the state of our society and the intelligence with which we are approaching or not approaching the world. This is not the Cold War. We're not the hegemon. We have to get along with other countries. The rest of the world is rising. We're not necessarily going down unless we take ourselves down. We ought to make sure we don't.
Well, there are no wiser words, that is for sure. Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for this conversation. Really appreciate your insight. Thank you.
You're most welcome. It was a pleasure.
All right, guys, that is it for tonight's show. That was a really, I think, insightful conversation. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, comments, you can always email me. I love hearing your feedback. Kim@KimIversen.com is how you can reach me. Otherwise, guys, I'm going to have a good weekend. I hope you have a great weekend as well. We will be back Monday with another great show, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. Until then, guys, have a great weekend. Good night.